Hey, what's up everyone? It's Phil Meyer. A few months ago, I released a video that explored the performance differences between a USB hard drive and a USB SSD on the Xbox 360. I've talked about USB storage on the Xbox 360 for a while now, starting with my first video in 2015. That's been a decade at this point, and I still get asked questions about USB storage on the Xbox 360. And one of the questions that comes up the most often is, how does the performance on the internal SATA hard drive compare with a USB SSD? So in this video, let's finally explore that. Let me just tell you about the setup for this test, and then we'll get into the examples. So first, my Xbox 360 has an official Microsoft internal SATA hard drive. This is the same hard drive that's been installed in the system ever since I've owned it. Second, the USB SSD I'll be using is the one that I used in my previous test, where I compared performance between a USB hard drive and a USB SSD. Now for the test, I'll be starting the games from both the hard drive and the SSD. When I start the games from the hard drive, the SSD will not be attached to the system. The save game and the game itself will be only on the hard drive. Then when I start games from the SSD, I've made sure to completely delete the game and the save game from the hard drive to ensure it's only loading from the SSD. Now the only thing I'm not sure about are title update patches for games. Oftentimes those are stored on the storage device that the game is on itself, but sometimes it's not totally transparent, and I believe it may be stored in the Xbox 360's cache, which might be on the hard drive. Either way, I don't think it's going to change the results of the test all that much, but I thought I should mention it. And lastly, why compare a USB SSD versus a SATA hard drive specifically? Well, on an unmodified Xbox 360, you can't just put in any old storage device into its SATA port and expect it to work. Technically, only official Microsoft internal hard drives are supported on the Xbox 360, but there are some modifications that would allow certain third-party drives to work. So today, if you have a stock Xbox 360, a really easy way to get more storage is just to use a USB device. Alright, now let's get into those tests, and at the end of the video, we'll discuss some of the findings and more details about the system. The first game we'll test is Dust. This is the game that I used in a brief comparison in the 2015 video. In that video, we saw the USB flash device was just a little bit faster than the internal hard drive. Let's see what happens this time. So this time around, loading from the SATA hard drive was a fraction of a second faster than loading from the SSD. Next up, we'll try Dead Island. I'll stop the timers on the first frame where the level is visible. So again, loading from the hard drive was a little faster than loading from the SSD. Alright, next let's try Fable 3. So in Fable 3, as soon as I pick a storage device, it'll start loading my last save from that device. That's when I'll start the timer, and I'll stop the timer on the first frame where the level is visible. So now things get a little more interesting, where loading from the USB SSD is just a little faster than loading from the SATA hard drive. So next up, let's try Sonic Generations. So in Sonic, when you load up your save, you'll end up in a hub world where you can use it to pick which level you want to play. So I'm going to do two different tests then. I'm going to test loading into the hub world, and then I'm going to test loading from the hub world into one of the levels. So the hard drive barely won by just a few frames. I kind of wonder if I tried again if the results would be different. So let's go ahead and see what happens when we load up the first level, Green Hill. When loading the level, the SSD actually came out ahead by a second. For the next game, I'll go with Hardcore Uprising, a 2D side-scroller set in the Contra universe. The timers will start on the first frame of Fade to Black, and when the load is complete, I actually have to hit a button to continue to the level. I'll hit that button as soon as I can, but I'll also stop the timer as soon as the button prompt appears.
Mission start.
Beginning operation.
Now this is probably the most interesting one so far. In this case, the internal hard drive just blew away the SSD, and in fact the SSD took over twice as long to finish loading. So next up is Sleeping Dogs, which is one of the games I tested in my prior video. I'll start the timers on the first frame where the button prompts fade from this load screen, and then I'll stop the timers on the first frame as we fade in the level. So in this case, the internal hard drive was faster by a couple seconds. Next up is Tomb Raider, released in 2013. The timers start as soon as I hit the button, and I'll stop them on the first frame of the level fade in. With Tomb Raider, loading my save from the USB SSD was just a little faster. Next up is The Witcher 2. I'll load my last save, which is near the end of the game. The timers start on the first frame of the loading screen and they'll end on the first frame of the level fade in.
What does it feel like to be almost dead?
So the results here are a little more notable. The hard drive finished sooner and took about 77% of the time as the SSD. For the last game, we'll go with Dead Rising 2. I never did complete this game and I really should go back and do that. When I start to load my save, there'll be a little pop-up dialog that shows. I'll start the timers on the first frame that dialog is visible, and I'll stop them on the first frame where we can see the level. So the results here were pretty close, but the hard drive came out ahead by 1 second. Alright, let's take a moment to go over what we just saw. The Xbox 360's SATA port is SATA 1, which has a theoretical maximum transfer speed of 1.5 gigabits a second. The SSD is bottlenecked by the Xbox's USB 2 ports. These have a maximum theoretical transfer speed of 480 megabits a second. So in theory, the SATA 1 port is more than 3 times as fast as the USB 2 ports. But as we saw, that doesn't necessarily translate to games loading 3 times as fast. In fact, the results weren't entirely consistent. There were cases where loading from the SSD over USB was actually faster than the hard drive, and there were cases where the hard drive was faster, and that was especially notable with Hardcore Uprising. Now, I kind of suspect the reason it took so much longer for Hardcore Uprising is that it probably loaded the entire level into memory before allowing you to play. Whereas in the other games, they probably stream in content as it's needed, so that initial load doesn't necessarily take as long. Games that load in small chunks of data that could be scattered across the game image could benefit more from the SSD's near instant seek time, even if it is over the more limited USB 2 ports. Those are just my thoughts and conjecture. I can't really say what the games are doing. At any rate, we saw that in many cases, both devices perform similarly. So let me know what you think. Drop a comment down below if you have some thoughts on what you just saw. Thanks for watching the video, and take care.